A billionaire left for a business deal and vanished without a trace. Days later, he was found barely alive, rescued by a barefoot 7-year-old girl living in a forgotten train car. What began as survival turned into something far deeper, a bond that would change all their lives forever. Before we begin, leave a comment below and let us know where you are watching from so we can say hello. Now let's get into the story. Wesley Grant wasn't just a billionaire, he was the billionaire. At 38, he stood at the pinnacle of power, a man who had turned a scrappy software startup in a college dorm into a tech empire that now spanned 5 continents. His name graced the covers of Forbes Business Weekly in every financial column that mattered. Investors watched his moves like hawks. Governments consulted him on infrastructure. He wasn't just successful, he was untouchable. Or so he thought. Wesley's days were a blur of back-to-back meetings, high-stakes negotiations, and black-tie galas. His Manhattan penthouse overlooked the skyline, sleek and sterile, filled with art he never had time to admire. His suits were tailored in Italy, his watches custom-crafted, his shoes shined by a man who only took appointments with royalty. But underneath the polish and power was a man who hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in a decade. A man who trusted almost no one except his inner circle, especially Marcus Grant, his cousin and CFO. Marcus, the one who grew up in the same broken home, the one Wesley gave a second chance when no one else would. It was that trust that would nearly cost Wesley his life. In the boardroom, Wesley commanded fear and admiration. But outside of it, he was vulnerable, distracted by spreadsheets, lulled by the illusion that money could buy security. He had no wife, no children. Just a cold steel fortress built on logic and numbers. He believed betrayal came from competitors, not from blood. He believed danger came in lawsuits, not in detours through unfamiliar mountains. He was wrong, and he was about to learn just how fragile the illusion of control could be. The wind whipped sharply across the airstrip as Wesley Grant stepped off his private jet, the cold mountain air biting through his custom gray suit. He adjusted the collar of his wool coat and squinted toward the sleepy town nestled in the hills ahead. It was a far cry from his penthouse in New York, but this trip wasn't about comfort. It was business, one final meeting to solidify a groundbreaking merger with a renewable energy firm that had caught his eye months earlier. He had every reason to believe it would be a routine 2-day trip. What he didn't know was that danger had already arrived long before he did. As his polished shoes hit the pavement, a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop in front of him. The driver, a man with a polite smile and mirrored sunglasses, stepped out and opened the door. Wesley nodded in appreciation, tossing his leather duffel into the back seat and sliding in. The scenery passed in a blur, winding roads, towering evergreens, and a fog creeping in from the mountain ridge like a silent omen. He checked his phone. No signal. Just for a moment, that unsettled him. Then he dismissed the thought. It was a small town, signal would return soon. The ride took longer than expected. Wesley leaned forward. "Are we taking a detour?" The driver replied calmly. "Just a shortcut, sir. Roads up here can be tricky." Wesley sat back, unsure why his gut clenched so tightly. Back in the city, Marcus Grant sipped aged bourbon in Wesley's office chair, legs crossed with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He should be off the grid by now, he muttered. Into his burner phone. "Don't screw this up. I want it to look like an accident." He'd waited years for this moment. Years of watching Wesley build an empire, always one step ahead, always admired. But now Marcus would step into the light with Wesley out of the way, presumed dead in some tragic remote car crash, and no one to question it. Back in the mountains, Wesley noticed the SUV turning onto a gravel path. "This doesn't feel right," he said under his breath. The driver didn't respond. Wesley reached for his phone again. Still no bars, just dense forest outside growing darker with every mile. Trees closed in like shadows. His instincts screamed. He leaned forward again. "I said, where are we?" No answer. That was when the first crack of fear struck him like thunder in his chest. He wasn't on his way to a business deal. He was being led straight into a trap. And he had no idea just how far they'd go to silence him. He just knew this wasn't business anymore. It was betrayal. As for Marcus Grant, he always knew how to smile and make people trust him. He had perfected it over years of playing second fiddle to Wesley, his older cousin, his rival, a reminder of everything he could never be. Behind closed doors, that smile disappeared, replaced by something colder, sharper. Jealousy had long been rooted in his chest, growing deeper with each success Wesley achieved. From their early childhood, Marcus had lived in Wesley's shadow. Wesley had the grades, the charm, the drive. Marcus. He had ambition too, but it was sour, bitter, twisted by resentment. When their grandfather passed and left the majority of the family's holdings to Wesley, the final thread of Marcus's restraint snapped. He told no one, not even his closest associates, about the plan he'd been building for months. To the public eye, Marcus was loyal, supportive. At company functions, he stood by Wesley's side, clinking champagne glasses and praising his vision. But when Wesley announced his trip to the secluded mountain town, Marcus saw an opening, a perfect stage for a vanishing act. He made the call that night. "Is the team ready?" he asked the gruff voice on the other end. "They don't ask questions," the man replied. "You want him gone? He's gone. No mistakes," Marcus warned. "It must look natural, no violence unless necessary." But deep down, he didn't care how it happened, so long as Wesley didn't come back. Over the following weeks, Marcus orchestrated every detail. He rerouted Wesley's flight through a small airport he had connections at. He replaced the driver with a mercenary fluent in fake charm. He paid off a hotel clerk to report Wesley as checked in, whether he arrived or not. Every move calculated, every loose end tied. The plan was simple: abduct Wesley upon arrival, keep him hidden for 3 days, then stage a fatal car accident on one of the mountain's deadly cliffs. A tragic end to a brilliant CEO. The media would eat it up. The board would be devastated, and Marcus, he'd step into power with a rehearsed speech and dry eyes. Sitting in Wesley's office, Marcus toyed with the billionaire's custom fountain pen, twirling it between his fingers. He looked around at the towering windows, the shelves lined with awards, the framed photo of Wesley shaking hands with presidents and foreign leaders. Soon it would all be his. He chuckled softly. He never saw it coming. But what Marcus failed to understand was that while greed sharpens ambition, it also dulls caution. And when you build your empire on betrayal, it only takes one misstep, one moment of unexpected resistance for the whole plan to shatter. And Wesley Grant, as Marcus would soon learn, was not a man who stayed down for long. The night air was heavy with fog, blanketing the winding road in an eerie stillness. Wesley sat quietly in the back seat of the SUV, his eyes fixed on the endless stretch of trees blurring past the windows. The headlights cut through the mist like weak flashlights, and he glanced again at his phone, still no signal. The silence in the car felt unnatural, too quiet, too controlled. Then, without warning, the SUV slowed. Wesley leaned forward. "Why are we stopping?" The driver gave a rehearsed shrug. "Small landslide ahead. We'll have to take a detour through an old logging trail. Locals use it all the time." Wesley frowned. The road was narrow, overgrown, and far too quiet for comfort. But before he could question further, the car turned sharply onto the gravel path, wheels crunching over rocks and twigs. The deeper they went, the darker it became. No houses, no street lights, just the sound of tires grinding and the occasional hoot of an owl. A sense of dread crept up Wesley's spine. He reached for his briefcase, searching instinctively for the backup phone he kept in the side pouch. That's when the driver spoke again, only this time his voice lost the friendliness. "Don't bother, no one's coming." Wesley's head snapped up just as the driver pulled a small canister from beneath the seat and sprayed a sickly sweet mist directly into the back of the car. Wesley gasped, coughing violently, eyes burning, lungs tightening. He kicked the door, clawed at the handle, but his strength faltered within seconds. Everything spun. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw was the reflection of the driver's smirk in the rearview mirror. When Wesley came to, his hands were tied tightly behind his back, his wrists raw against coarse rope. His head pounded, and the air smelled of damp wood and rot. He was no longer in the car, but inside a dark, dilapidated cabin. The floor beneath him was hard and uneven, layered in dust and old leaves. A single hanging bulb flickered dimly from the ceiling, casting shifting shadows on the peeling walls. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and his tongue felt thick. Panic set in. He pulled at the ropes until his skin burned, but they didn't budge. A voice echoed from outside the door. "Boss says keep him alive until Thursday, then we'll stage the crash." Another voice chuckled. "Easy, no one's going to look for him out here." Wesley's blood ran cold. He realized then the gravity of what had happened. He had been cut off completely. No one knew where he was. The driver, the detour, the blackout. It had all been a trap. And somewhere out there, Marcus was waiting for a phone call confirming his accident. Wesley wasn't just lost. He'd been erased. The first day, they barely spoke to him. One man, burly with a scar across his cheek, shoved a cracked bowl of lukewarm water toward him. Drink or don't, we don't care. Wesley reached for it with trembling fingers only to have it kicked over before he could touch it. Laughter followed. His stomach twisted in knots from hunger and fury. By the second day, the taunting began. Marcus is going to have everything you built, one of them sneered while pacing the room, tossing peanuts into his mouth. Pretty buildings, fat accounts, hell, even your office chair, another added. You'll be ashes by Friday. Car goes off the cliff, boom, headlines say tragedy. People cry, markets dip. Then poof, it's all his. They laughed like it was a bar joke, but every word stabbed Wesley deeper than the last. His cousin, his own blood, had planned this. Paid men to torture and kill him like garbage. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the betrayal burning in his chest. On the third day, Wesley could barely lift his head. His lips were cracked and his voice had dwindled to a rasp. He had no idea how much time had passed. The light bulb above him flickered occasionally, taunting him with false hope. Late that afternoon, he heard them talking just outside the cabin door. This time, their tone was serious. "Car's ready. Tonight's the night," said the leader, zipping up a heavy coat. "You sure the drop's steep enough?" 200 feet straight down, no guardrail, no camera. By morning, he's just another tragic accident on a lonely road. Wesley's breath caught in his throat. They were going to do it tonight. Terror surged through him, but so did something else, defiance. He hadn't clawed his way to the top of the business world by folding under pressure. He'd fought harder battles in boardrooms, outmaneuvered hostile takeovers, stared down billion-dollar decisions with a cool head. But this was survival. And somehow, someway, he had to make it out alive before the night was over. Because if he didn't, no one would ever know the truth. Dusk settled over the woods like a slow, suffocating blanket. Inside the cabin, Wesley lay motionless on the cold floor, eyes barely open to breath, shallow. Every inch of his body screamed with pain, but his mind was still burning with the raw instinct to survive. Outside, he heard movement. Boots scuffed against the wooden porch, voices murmuring. Then the unmistakable sound of heavy equipment being dragged, chains, metal cases, something clunking into the trunk of a vehicle. They were preparing. He had minutes, maybe less. With what little strength he had left, Wesley rolled onto his side. His right wrist, still chained to the floor, throbbed with every heartbeat. That's when his fingers brushed something cold, a rusted loose pipe that must have fallen from the crumbling wall. His pulse spiked. Gripping the jagged end, he forced the pipe between his wrist and the chain loop, twisting, grinding, cutting through skin and rust. Sparks of pain shot through his arm. Blood dripped steadily, but he didn't stop. He bit his lips so hard it bled just to keep from crying out. Minutes passed like hours. Then with one final wrench, the chain gave way with a harsh metallic snap. Wesley collapsed onto his side, panting, dizzy from blood loss and adrenaline. But he was free. Barely able to stand, he dragged himself toward the shattered window near the back wall. Broken glass still lined the frame. He tore off part of his shirt and wrapped it around his arm to shield it, then hoisted himself up, legs trembling beneath him. His body didn't want to move, but his will refused to die. With a grunt, he squeezed through the narrow gap glass, slicing through the fabric. He fell hard onto the wet dirt outside, the scent of pine and cold air hitting him like a slap. For a moment, he lay there motionless, staring up at the darkening sky. Then he rolled over and crawled into the woods, into the shadows. Behind him, the cabin buzzed with chatter. One of the men cursed. "Did you hear that?" Wesley didn't wait to find out. He stumbled through thick underbrush branches, clawing at his face and arms. The forest was dense and disorienting, and every step was agony. But freedom was close, he could feel it. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know how long he could last it. All he knew was that if he stopped moving, they would find him. And this time they wouldn't tie him up. They'd kill him. The forest swallowed Wesley whole. With each staggering step, the world around him blurred into twisted shapes of shadow and bark. The crisp mountain air that once felt refreshing now stabbed at his lungs, raw from smoke and exhaustion. Branches lashed against his face, his once crisp shirt clinging to him in damp shreds. The sharp scent of pine and wet earth mingled with the metallic tang of his own blood. He had no idea where he was going, only that he couldn't stop. His legs threatened to give out with every stride, and still he pushed forward, one trembling foot after the other. His sleek, tailored pants were ripped at the knees, his dress shoes soaked and caked in mud. Gone was the commanding presence of Wesley Grant, the billionaire CEO who moved through glass towers and boardrooms with calm authority. Now he was just a man, battered, hunted, and desperately clinging to life. The darkness pressed in like a living thing. Without stars or moonlight, the path vanished before him. Every snap of a twig sent him diving behind rocks. Every rustle of leaves made his heart lurch into his throat. Was it the wind, or were they still behind him? He could still hear their voices in his mind. Tonight's the night. No one's going to look for him out here. He shook his head, trying to drown them out. But the more he wandered, the more it felt like the forest was closing in. Roots tangled around his feet. Thorns tore at his skin, and hunger gnawed at his insides like an invisible predator. His body was screaming, but his mind refused to shut down. He couldn't afford to break. Not now. He stumbled into a ravine, crashing onto the damp earth with a groan. For a moment he lay there, face pressed to the mossy ground, his breath shallow and ragged. Tears threatened to rise of frustration, of fear of the sheer injustice of it all. He had built empires. He had made impossible deals across continents. He had walked into government halls with confidence and left with contracts worth billions. And yet here he was, beaten down to nothing by the greed of someone he once called family. Wesley wiped the blood from his brow with the back of his shaking hand. He tried to rise, failed, then tried again. His jaw clenched. His eyes scanned the dark, hoping, begging for something. A light, a road, a voice. But there was nothing. Just the sound of crickets. The echo of his own breath. And the cold, terrifying truth. He was completely, utterly alone. The first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon, casting a soft orange hue over the trees. Somewhere on the outskirts of a forgotten town, a rusted landfill lay quiet, the wind stirring plastic bags and broken cans like ghosts in the mist. Amid the scattered trash and twisted metal, a small figure moved barefoot, dragging a torn burlap sack almost half her size. Ruby knew this place like the back of her hand. At just 7 years old, she could pick through the piles faster than most adults, always searching for cans, bottles, anything that could fetch a few coins. Her oversized hoodie nearly swallowed her thin frame, and her tangled blonde hair clung to her cheeks, streaked with dirt and dried leaves. Her eyes, however wide alert and much too old for her age, missed nothing. That's why she stopped. Amid the broken crates and heaps of garbage, something didn't look right. Someone. At first, she thought it was a mannequin, maybe something dumped from an old store. But when she crept closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was a man, tall, still slumped against a rusted barrel, with his legs stretched awkwardly, his shirt torn open, smeared with blood and grime. His face was bruised, barely visible beneath a layer of mud and stubble. His lips were cracked. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Ruby's instincts told her to run. But something else, something quieter, made her step forward. She nudged his shoulder gently. "Hey, mister, are you okay?" The man stirred, his eyes flickering open. He blinked up at her, confused, disoriented. His throat was dry, unable to speak. Ruby gently helped him sit up. "Why are you lying here? What happened to you?" Her voice was soft. Wesley looked into Ruby's eyes. I was kidnapped by a group of people. They captured me and held me for 3 days now." His voice was dry as sandpaper. "Do you need help?" Ruby said softly. He nodded slightly, and that was all she needed. Without another word, Ruby wrapped her small fingers around his wrist. "Let's go. I can't stay here. It's not safe." "I can't," he whispered, his body shaking with weakness. "You don't have to go," she said. "Just lean on me. I'll help." And somehow, with the strength only a child driven by survival can muster, she guided him one painful step at a time, away from the dump and toward the hidden corner of the world she called home. He didn't ask questions. He couldn't. But something in the way she looked at him, with fierce determination and zero fear, told him he wasn't completely lost. In that moment, Wesley Grant, a man who'd once commanded skyscrapers and private jets, owed his life to a little girl with no shoes, no family name, and no reason to help him. But she did. Because in her world, people didn't survive by looking away. They survived by reaching out. The morning was still wrapped in a gray fog that blanketed the crumbling streets. Ruby led Wesley through narrow back alleys, her small hand firmly gripping his wrist as if her touch alone could hold him upright. He stumbled more than once, his body barely cooperating, but she never scolded him. She simply paused, waited for him to steady, then pulled him along again. They crossed behind broken-down buildings, overgrown lots, and rusting fences until they reached the edge of an abandoned rail yard. A single graffitied train car sat crooked on the tracks, half swallowed by weeds and time. It was dented, its paint-peeling windows boarded or shattered. But to Ruby, it was home. This way, she whispered, hopping up the steps and swinging open the door with a creak. Wesley hesitated, then followed, his muscles aching with every movement. Inside it was dim and smelled of old metal dust and something faintly sweet, maybe dried fruit or the remains of a candy wrapper tucked in the corner. There was no furniture, just old crates, worn blankets, and a torn mattress laid on top of flattened cardboard. A makeshift curtain of stitched-together cloth hung across one side, separating the space into what Ruby likely considered rooms. "Here," she said, guiding him toward the mattress. "You can lie down. It's lumpy, but it's better than the ground." Wesley sank down with a groan, feeling the springs press against his spine. And yet he'd never felt more grateful. She covered him with a thin blanket and sat cross-legged beside him. "Watching. No one comes here," she added, her voice low but sure. "Not police, not strangers, not even the dogs. It's safe, I promise." He looked at her, then really looked. A little girl with dirt-streaked cheeks and wild blonde hair, wearing a coat 5 sizes too big, and socks with holes at the toes. Yet her eyes were steady, her tone calm. She wasn't just surviving, she was managing, protecting, leading. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Alone." Ruby shrugged. "I'm not alone. My sister and brother are here too. You'll meet them soon. They're sleeping behind the curtain." A quiet beat passed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ruby." He nodded slowly. "Ruby, thank you." She smiled faintly. "You look like you needed someone." As Wesley drifted into uneasy sleep, pain still pulsing through him, one thing echoed louder than the rest. In a place forgotten by the world, a little girl with nothing had given him something more valuable than money, more precious than safety. She had given him shelter and a second chance to fight. The soft coughs behind the curtain were the first sounds Wesley heard as he stirred awake, his body still aching, but no longer trembling with cold. The dim light leaking through the boarded-up window painted the train car in sepia tones, dusty, quiet, and strangely peaceful. Ruby sat nearby, legs tucked beneath her, peeling the label off an empty can as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She's awake," Ruby said softly, noticing his gaze shifting toward the other side of the room. "You should meet them." She rose and gently pulled back the patchwork curtain. Behind it, nestled in a nest of old blankets and flattened cardboard, lay a girl so much like Ruby, it was as though Wesley was seeing double. But this girl, Rosie, was paler, thinner, her lips cracked and her chest rising unevenly with each breath. She turned her head slowly and managed a weak smile. "She's my twin," Ruby explained. "She's been sick a long time. Mostly stays under the covers." Wesley sat up slowly, wincing at the pain still laced through his ribs. "Hi there," he rasped. Rosie lifted a frail hand in greeting. Are you okay?" The concern in her voice struck him harder than he expected. This girl, barely holding herself together, was worried about him. "I've been better," he admitted, offering the closest thing to a smile he could muster. Next to Rosie, a small boy peeked up from beneath a threadbare blanket, his round face half hidden behind a battered plastic toy truck. The wheels were broken, but he held it like it was treasure. "That's Max," Ruby said proudly. "He's 4, and that truck's name is Henry." Max didn't speak, just stared at Wesley with wide, curious eyes. Then slowly he crawled forward and offered the toy. Wesley blinked, touched beyond words. "Thanks, buddy," he murmured, gently taking it. Ruby looked around the cramped space with quiet dignity. "It's not much, but it's ours. I get food when I can, sometimes from behind stores, sometimes cans. Rosie needs warm stuff, so I find blankets when people throw them away." Wesley couldn't find his voice. The enormity of what he was seeing hit him all at once. 3 children completely alone. No parents, no support, no one even aware they existed, just surviving on scraps, courage, and each other. "How long have you been here?" he finally asked. "A while," Ruby replied. "Long enough to know no one's coming." Wesley looked down at the broken truck in his lap, then back at the kids. He had once feared dying alone in a cabin forgotten. But these children, they were living it, and somehow they still managed to smile. The train car grew quiet as evening settled in the last hints of daylight fading behind the boarded windows. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall weeds and rattled loose pieces of metal. But inside, a fragile sense of calm took hold. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty but earned. Wesley lay still on the thin mattress, his body broken but his mind more awake than it had been in days. Pain pulsed through every muscle, but another sensation stirred beneath. It's something unfamiliar, long forgotten. It wasn't fear, it was connection. As he looked toward the far end of the cabin, he saw Ruby carefully tucking Rosie beneath a thicker layer of blankets. Her small hands moved with practiced gentleness, pausing to press her fingers to her sister's forehead. Then she turned toward the door, where she picked up a long stick nearly as tall as she was, and settled herself by the entrance cross-legged and alert. She didn't say it out loud, but Wesley understood she was keeping watch. At the other end of the car, Max had inched his way closer without Wesley even realizing. Now the little boy lay curled against Wesley's side, one hand resting on Wesley's arm, the other still clutching the broken toy truck. Wesley stared at the ceiling, the child's small body pressing against his ribs, and felt something shift in his chest. He had spent the last decade surrounded by assistants, analysts, and board members, people who deferred to him, obeyed him, but never truly saw him. Yet here were three children with nothing offering him warmth, space, even protection, without a single question about who he was or why he had appeared at their door. They simply let him belong. Wesley turned his head slowly toward Max, watching the boy's slow, steady breathing. It had been years too many since anyone had trusted him like that, and it had been even longer since he'd felt the quiet need to protect someone else. Not for profit, not for image, but just because he could. He looked toward Ruby again. She hadn't taken her eyes off the door. The stick rested across her lap like a weapon, her expression calm but unyielding. She reminded him of a soldier, small but resolute, standing between danger and the people she loved. "You shouldn't have to do this," he whispered almost to himself. Ruby looked back at him briefly, then shrugged. "Someone has to." Wesley felt his throat tighten. That night, as the wind howled and cold seeped through the cracks of the train car, Wesley Grant didn't dream of boardrooms or betrayals. He dreamt of three children in the shadows, and the fierce, fragile bond that had begun between them, strangers, yes, but not for much longer. The morning sun filtered faintly through the cracks in the train car's walls, casting narrow beams of light onto the floor. The air was cold and dew clung to the rusted metal frame like frost on a grave. Wesley woke slowly, his body sore and his breath shallow, but something had changed. He could feel it. The panic had ebbed, replaced by something more focused. It wasn't strength exactly, but purpose. The children's quiet courage had sparked something in him the night before, and now lying beneath a frayed blanket next to a softly snoring Max, Wesley knew he had to act. He couldn't let this be the end, not for himself and not for them. Ruby was already awake. She sat crouched near a stack of plastic bottles she'd gathered in the early morning, sorting them into bags. Her movements were swift and practiced, her face serious as if organizing garbage was a matter of life and death. "Ruby," Wesley said softly, his voice still raw. She looked up, brushing a lock of blonde hair from her face. "Do you have a phone? Anything I could use to send a message?" Her brow furrowed. "We don't have service, not out here, I know, but maybe something broken or not." Ruby didn't respond at first. She disappeared behind the curtain and returned with a small, cracked flip phone. The screen was shattered, and most of the buttons were worn down, but the moment she placed it in Wesley's hand, he felt a jolt of possibility surge through him. "It doesn't work anymore," she said quietly. "Been dead for months." Wesley turned it over in his hand. It was an old model, cheap plastic casing, no battery cover, held together with duct tape, but it had a SIM card, and that might be enough. He nodded. "Can I try something?" She gave a cautious shrug. "Sure." He reached into his jacket. The inside pocket still held his pen and a metal money clip. both useless now, except he peeled away the clip and used its edge to pry off the back of the phone. The battery was swollen but intact. He adjusted it slightly, twisted the copper contacts, then pressed the power button. Nothing. Come on. He shifted the phone to rest against the cold metal wall of the train car, then tapped it against a rusty beam for static charge, something he remembered seeing once on a survival show during a long flight. The odds were slim, but right now slim was a luxury. A soft blink. Wesley froze. The screen lit up, dim, flickering, but alive. A low battery warning flashed, followed by a signal icon, one tiny bar. Just one. His heart pounded. He navigated the worn buttons with shaking hands, scrolling through to compose a text. The keys stuck. The screen faded in and out, but he managed it. Help, I'm alive. GPS on. WG. There was only one number he trusted with his life, Elaine. His assistant, his friend. The only person who would believe a message this vague and act fast. He selected her contact, hit send, and waited. Ruby crouched beside him, eyes wide. Did it go through? I don't know, he whispered, staring at the screen as the loading icon spun. The phone buzzed once. Message sent. The screen flickered, then died completely. Wesley exhaled, trembling. Relief, disbelief, and exhaustion hit him all at once. He placed the phone gently on the mattress like it was a relic. Ruby reached out and touched his arm. Will they come? He looked at her, at the dirt under her fingernails, the soft worry in her voice, the way she clutched her two large sleeves like armor. They will, he said. If that message got through, they'll come. She nodded, not quite smiling. Okay. But Wesley knew the truth. It was the most fragile word in the world right now. If Elaine saw the message, if the coordinates were enough, if they reached him before Marcus realized he was alive. Still, for the first time in days, there was hope. Not a flood, just a flicker. But flickers can become flames. And flames can light the way out of even the darkest forest. Wesley leaned back and looked around the train car. Rosie coughed softly from behind the curtain. Max stirred beside him, curling into his side once more. He hadn't escaped yet, but the world might know he was still here, and that was the first step home. The skyline of Manhattan glistened beneath the early morning sun, its glass towers catching the light like polished blades. The city was alive with its usual energy, horns blaring, taxis darting through traffic, espresso machines hissing behind cafe counters. But within the upper floors of Grant and Vale International's headquarters, something far colder was unfolding. Marcus Grant stood at the head of the boardroom table, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that perfectly hugged his frame. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as senior executives, legal advisors, and PR heads exchanged glances. A portrait of Wesley still hung behind the sleek glass wall, his sharp features and confident smile now a ghostly reminder of a man they believed gone. Marcus cleared his throat and tapped a finger against the mahogany table. Silence fell instantly. It is with a heavy heart he began, eyes cast downward, with a practiced air of sorrow, that I confirm the devastating loss of our founder and CEO, Wesley Grant. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. One of the women at the table covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Another man closed his eyes, head bowed. Marcus continued. Late last night, we were informed by local authorities that Wesley's vehicle was discovered at the base of a ravine outside Glen Rock, a remote mountain town where he had traveled for a private business meeting. Preliminary reports suggest the car lost control on a narrow road during inclement weather. No one questioned the story. The location was obscure, the terrain dangerous, and Wesley had been traveling alone. The perfect storm. I've spoken with legal counsel, Marcus said, voice steady, and the transition process will begin immediately. Wesley's final wishes, as detailed in the documents we uncovered, named me as interim chairman and acting CEO. He opened a leather folder and placed several signed documents on the table, all stamped and notarized. What no one knew was that every signature had been forged. Days earlier, Marcus had contacted a shadowy document handler through one of his old college connections. Money was no object. The will, the authorization forms, even a predated letter of resignation drafted by Wesley, he had it all fabricated. He'd anticipated every legal hurdle and already greased the wheels to make them vanish. Now he wore grief like a tailored suit, complete with just the right amount of hesitation in his voice. I promise to honor Wesley's vision, he said solemnly, and to continue the work we all believe in. The room erupted in polite applause, some genuine, most uncertain, but no one dared object. Later that afternoon, the headlines broke. Tech titan Wesley Grant presumed dead in tragic crash. Billionaire lost in remote mountains, Marcus Grant to step in as acting CEO. Media outlets ran glossy photo collages of Wesley's career milestones, charity events, awards. News anchors shared sound bites from former colleagues and industry giants mourning his loss. Stock prices dipped, but not dramatically, investors reassured by Marcus's familiar face and steady voice. He held press conferences, standing behind velvet ropes with tears in his eyes and his hand over his heart. "We were more than cousins," he told one reporter. "He was like a brother to me. This company, it's his legacy, and I will protect it." Behind closed doors, however, Marcus celebrated. He moved into Wesley's office that same evening, standing by the tall windows that overlooked the city, drink in hand. The bourbon was expensive, aged 20 years, Wesley's favorite. Marcus took a long sip, savoring the burn, then ran his hand along the smooth edge of the desk that was now his. He had done it. The man who had always been one step ahead was gone, and the world had already begun to forget. But Marcus had one blind spot, one loose end he hadn't truly considered. Wesley was still alive, and even now wounded and lost in some forgotten train car. He had just sent out a signal that could burn Marcus's perfect plan to the ground. The countdown had already begun. But Marcus, he was too busy rehearsing his next speech. Elaine Harper stared at her phone, heart pounding. The screen was cracked from when it slipped from her hand moments ago, and she barely noticed the glass cutting into her palm as she gripped it tightly. Her mind refused to believe it at first, but the message was there. "Help, I'm alive. GPS on. WG." She'd read it 3 times. Each time her breath caught in her throat. It had come from a number she hadn't seen active in months, an old burner Wesley had kept only for emergencies. 1 bar of signal, no follow-up. Just that one desperate line. Elaine's office in Midtown was dark now, the rest of the staff gone home hours earlier. Only the soft glow of computer monitors and the blinking city lights outside reminded her that the world hadn't stopped, but hers nearly had. She moved on instinct. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as she pulled up the GPS ping from the text metadata. Coordinates: in the mountains outside a forgotten town called Glen Rock. A name she remembered only from Wesley's calendar, a quiet location where he was supposed to finalize a private deal. Only he had never returned, and Marcus had insisted he'd died there. Elaine had refused to accept it. Something had always felt wrong. Wesley was careful, meticulous, not the type to drive off a cliff in the middle of nowhere. But now her gut had been right. He was alive. Elaine stood, grabbed her coat, and dialed as she moved. "This is Harper. I need a chopper in the air within the hour. No questions. I'm sending coordinates. And get me Glen Rock's Sheriff's Department on the line. Tell them this is a federal-level emergency. I'll brief them on arrival." She didn't wait for confirmation. She had worked for Wesley for nearly a decade, his assistant, his scheduler, his gatekeeper. But more than that, she was his friend, and she owed him her life many times over. 15 minutes later, she was racing toward a private airfield outside the city. Rain lashed the windshield, the kind of storm that made air traffic control flinch. But Elaine didn't flinch. She gritted her teeth, speeding through intersections, cursing every red light. Her phone buzzed again. Not Wesley, just dispatch confirming the chopper was fueled and ready. She reached the helipad just as the pilot climbed aboard. The rotor blades started to spin, slicing through the night with a mechanical fury that matched her own. "Elaine Harper." The sheriff's voice crackled through her earpiece as she strapped in. "You sure this isn't a hoax?" I'm sure she said firmly. "If he's alive, we're already behind." The flight was brutal. Wind battered the aircraft. The mountain terrain rose in jagged shadows beneath them. Elaine stared at the GPS on her tablet like a lifeline. Every bump, every jolt made her heart climb into her throat. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't afford to answer yet. What condition was he in? Who took him? Was he injured? Could they even find him in time? But one truth remained constant in her chest like a drumbeat. He was alive, and she had a chance to bring him home. They reached the outer edge of Glen Rock by sunrise. Below, the sheriff's cruisers were already waiting, headlights bouncing through the misty woods. Elaine landed, hard boots sinking into soft earth as she stepped onto the clearing. "Show me the exact coordinates," she barked. Sheriff Daniels, a gruff man with tired eyes, nodded. "We've got a few rangers who know this part of the forest. No real trails out there. Place is practically abandoned. Good, Elaine said. Moon. That means fewer people to clean up behind whoever did this. A dozen searchers fanned out, some on foot, others on ATVs. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning the ground with thermal cameras. Every minute mattered. Elaine stayed with the command unit, watching the grid light up slowly on her screen, praying Wesley was still somewhere inside it. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, Wes, hold on." She refused to imagine the alternative. Somewhere out there, the man the world had already buried was waiting, and she wasn't going to let him down. The air was thick with mist as dawn began to break, painting the sky with a dull gray that blurred the edges of the horizon. Inside the abandoned train car, the cold bit at Wesley's skin. He stirred awake to a low, unfamiliar rumble in the distance, like the growl of thunder rolling across the mountains. But it wasn't thunder. The sound grew louder. Rotors. Wesley's heart jumped. A second later, the door to the train car creaked open. Ruby stood there barefoot, her tattered hoodie whipping in the wind, her eyes wide with disbelief and hope. Her hair, tangled and golden, was pulled back by the breeze as she pointed upward with trembling fingers. "They're here," she shouted, her voice breaking. "They're here." Wesley struggled to rise, propping himself up with an elbow. His vision swam, and pain radiated through every joint, but adrenaline surged through his veins like fire. Outside, above the treetops, the shape of a helicopter emerged through the fog, its blades slicing the air, there circling low and fast. Moments later, another followed. Then the sound of engines from the forest floor. Tires, footsteps, shouts. It was all happening at once. Ruby darted across the room, kneeling beside Wesley. "Can you stand?" she asked, breathless. He managed a nod. "I can try." Before either of them could move, the door to the train car flew open again, and two figures burst in, dressed in tactical gear, voices sharp and authoritative. Wesley Grant, one of them, barked, eyes scanning the room. Wesley lifted a weak hand. "Here." The man rushed to his side immediately, radioing into his headset. "We've got him. Repeat, we've got the target. He's alive." Within seconds, more boots pounded against the metal steps. A medic dropped to her knees beside him, checking his pulse and shining a flashlight into his eyes. "He's dehydrated, malnourished. Possible fractures," she said quickly. "We need a stretcher now." As they worked, Ruby stepped back, suddenly uncertain. For the first time, she looked small, not just physically, but emotionally, like she wasn't sure what came next. Wesley noticed. His hand, still weak, reached for hers. "Stay close," he whispered. "You're not going anywhere without me." Ruby blinked, eyes shimmering. She nodded and grabbed his hand tightly, her small fingers wrapping around his. Minutes later, two rescue workers slid a stretcher beside Wesley and carefully lifted him onto it. He winced in pain, but kept his gaze on Ruby. One of the medics reached for her, gently guiding her out. "You coming with us, sweetheart?" "She is," Wesley said firmly, even as the oxygen mask was placed over his face. "Her name's Ruby, and her siblings are in here too." The responders sprang into action. Rosie, still curled beneath her blankets, was quickly assessed and wrapped in a thermal sheet. Max was scooped up gently, still clinging to his broken toy truck. He didn't cry, just stared with wide eyes at the flurry of strangers in black and blue uniforms. Wesley was wheeled toward the clearing outside, the fog parting as floodlights from the helicopters lit the path. The ground crew formed a line, shielding them from wind and debris as the stretcher was loaded into the chopper. Just before the doors closed, Ruby scrambled in beside him. She refused the offered seat and knelt on the floor, still holding his hand. The moment the helicopter lifted, Wesley felt the full weight of everything collapse onto his chest, not just the pain, the hunger, the exhaustion, but the raw emotion of survival. He was alive. Against all odds, he had survived. But he hadn't done it alone. The noise of the rotors drowned out the world below as the ground shrank beneath them. Trees turned to mossy dots, then blurred into mist. He looked over at Ruby, who now leaned against his stretcher, her head resting on his arm. "You saved my life," he murmured. She didn't answer right away. Then softly, "You looked like you needed someone." The medic smiled. "She's one tough little guardian angel." Wesley's eyes stung. The fog was finally behind them. And for the first time in days, maybe years, he felt like he wasn't just being pulled from the wreckage. He was being pulled back to purpose, to family, and to a promise he'd already made in his heart. If he lived through this, he'd make sure they lived better. The wind from the spinning rotors whipped through the clearing, stirring up leaves dust in the scent of pine. Lights from the rescue helicopters cast a surreal glow over the ragged train car and the tangle of weeds surrounding it. Search teams moved with precision, loading supplies, directing people securing the perimeter. Inside the rescue chopper, just moments before liftoff, Wesley Grant fought through the fog of pain and medication to speak. His throat was dry and his body trembled beneath layers of blankets and medical wraps. Yet his voice, though faint, was steady. "Wait," he whispered to the flight medic. "Before we go." The medic leaned in. Sir Wesley turned his head toward the children. Rosie was wrapped tightly in a thermal blanket, her pale face barely visible as she dozed under light sedation, her breathing assisted by oxygen. Max sat on a rescuer's lap nearby, cradling the broken toy truck like it was made of gold, his wide eyes scanning everything around him. Ruby stood at the edge of the cabin, wind in her hair, looking older than 7, like someone who'd seen too much, held too much for far too long. Wesley reached out a hand, weak but open. "Come here," he said, voice cracking. Ruby hesitated only a second, then stepped forward and knelt beside him. Her small, dirt-smudged fingers closed around his hand again, the same way they had when she'd pulled him from the edge of death. "You saved me," he said, looking her in the eye. "You all did. I wouldn't be here without you." Ruby didn't smile. She simply nodded as if that truth didn't need celebrating. It just was. "Most people," she replied quietly, "don't stop for us. They just walk by. But you were different. I could tell." Wesley blinked slowly, overwhelmed by the clarity in her voice. "You didn't even know who I was." "Didn't need to," Ruby said. "You looked like someone important." Wesley laughed softly, though it hurt. "Well, maybe I was, but I think you're the important one now." Ruby shrugged, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Important people should have someone watching out for them. That's what Max always says." At that, Wesley's eyes misted. He looked at the small boy again, still clutching the truck, still watching everything. He tightened his grip on Ruby's hand gently. "I want you to remember something," he said. "This moment, this promise." Ruby tilted her head. "I'm not going to forget you. Not ever. You gave me my life back, and I'm going to spend the rest of it making sure you and your brother and sister have yours." Ruby blinked quickly, like she wasn't used to hearing words like that, especially not from people like him. "You don't have to," she said quietly. "Yes, I do," Wesley replied. "You're my family now, whether you like it or not." There was silence, heavy and full. Then Ruby finally smiled. It was small, but it lit her whole face. "Okay, but only if Max gets to keep his truck." Wesley chuckled again, even as his eyes stung. "It's yours, forever." The medic leaned over again. "We have to go, sir." Wesley nodded. "Take us home." As the helicopter rose into the sky, the earth fell away beneath them, and the ghost of the train car faded into the misty morning light. The engines roared, and the rescue crew fastened harnesses and checked vitals, but all Wesley could see was the little girl still holding his hand. He watched her glance out the window with wonder and hesitation. Her world was changing by the second. She had no idea what was coming next. But he did. A real bed, clean clothes, doctors who could help Rosie breathe without coughing every hour of the night, school books and warm meals, laughter that didn't have to be whispered in the dark, and most of all, safety. Wesley looked at Max, who was finally beginning to smile, and Rosie, who stirred faintly in sleep, and Ruby, his tiny savior. He had built towers, closed billion-dollar deals, and spoken in front of presidents. But this was the most important promise he had ever made, and this time he would not let it break. The return of Wesley Grant shook the city like thunder cracking over steel towers. It began with whispers, rumors no one dared believe. A blurry photo snapped by a flight medic leaked online, Wesley pale and bandaged, lying on a stretcher with a little girl clutching his hand. The news spread like wildfire, crashing through every newsroom and boardroom, from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Wesley Grant, alive, survived alleged kidnapping and assassination plot. CEO returns after faking death or attempted murder. Exclusive rescue from the wilderness. The real story behind the Grant disappearance. But behind the headlines, a storm was building. Wesley didn't wait. From the moment the hospital cleared him for limited movement, he requested a private briefing room flanked by detectives, attorneys, and federal agents. His voice was still hoarse, his steps slow, but his mind sharp as ever. He laid out everything, the trip, the driver, the strange detour, the faces of the men in the cabin, and most of all, the man who orchestrated it, Marcus Grant, his own cousin. He knew every detail of my trip, Wesley said, voice steady. He planted the driver, he staged the crash, he forged the papers, and he had every intention of making sure I didn't survive to expose it. The investigators didn't need more than a day. They subpoenaed Marcus's communications, financial records, travel logs. The evidence unraveled fast payments to shell companies, connections to ex-military contractors, doctored legal documents with forged signatures, and, most damning of all, a phone call intercepted from Marcus to a known forger days before Wesley's disappearance. When they came for Marcus, he was in Wesley's former office, feet up on the desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, reviewing mock-ups of a new media campaign featuring his own face. He didn't even look up when the doors burst open. Marcus Grant, the agent, said, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder fraud and corporate embezzlement." The smirk vanished. Handcuffs clicked round his wrist as reporters outside captured every second. The man who tried to steal an empire was dragged from the glass tower in front of the very city he tried to fool. And the world. It watched in stunned silence. 3 days later, Wesley returned limping thinner, visibly scarred, but standing. He didn't arrive in a limousine or a black SUV. He walked through the front doors of Grant and Vale with Ruby holding his hand, Max clutching his other sleeve, and Rosie being wheeled in beside him. He wasn't just reclaiming a company. He was bringing with him the truth. The lobby filled with applause as employees, many of whom had questioned the official story, lined the halls to welcome him back. Tears, cheers, relief. But Wesley didn't stop to soak it in. He held a press conference the next morning, facing a wall of cameras and microphones. "I was betrayed by someone I once called family," he began, his voice clear. "But I was saved by people who owed me nothing. Children. Children who had less than anyone I've ever met, but gave more than anyone I've ever known." He turned to Ruby, standing just off stage, her small hand wrapped around a stuffed rabbit someone had gifted her at the hospital. "They gave me my life back," he said, voice cracking. "Now it's my turn to give them a future." Reporters leaned forward, pens flying. "I will be resuming my role as CEO," Wesley continued, "but things are going to change. Effective immediately, we are launching the Second Chance Initiative, a nonprofit division dedicated to housing, education, and medical care for homeless children and families across the country." The room erupted. His board, once manipulated by Marcus, now stood behind him, every member resworn, every crooked deal Marcus touched dissolved or investigated. Justice didn't just come in court. It came in truth, in rebuilding, in holding up the broken parts of a system and saying, "This isn't enough, we can do more." And Wesley, he no longer moved through the world with just wealth and power. Now he carried purpose. The scars on his hands were still fresh, but so was the fire in his heart. And as he watched Ruby wave at the cameras, Max grin with his truck in hand, and Rosie smile weakly from her chair, he knew this was only the beginning. His company would rise again, but this time it would rise for them. The iron gates of the Grant estate opened with a soft mechanical hum, revealing a private drive that wound through rows of blooming magnolias and cherry trees. Morning sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled patterns on the sleek black car rolling gently toward the main house. In the back seat, Ruby sat pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She said nothing, but her wide eyes missed nothing either. Beside her, Max clutched his truck legs, dangling over the edge of the leather seat. He had never been inside a car like this one, where the seats smelled like vanilla and the glass didn't rattle with every bump. Rosie lay between them, bundled in a soft blanket, her eyes tired but clearer than they'd been in days. For the first time in months, her breathing wasn't a ragged struggle. The car rolled to a stop at the front steps of the Grant estate, a grand mansion of soft gray stone ivy climbing its walls like a fairy tale. The front doors were tall and white, framed by flower beds and golden lights that still flickered faintly from the night before. To Ruby, it looked more like a palace than a home. Wesley stepped out first. He moved carefully, his cane clicking against the marble path, but his posture was strong, stronger than anyone expected after what he'd endured. He turned to the children and opened the door himself. "You ready?" he asked. Ruby didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the house, then back at Wesley. We can really stay here. He nodded once. This is your home now. No more hiding. No more running. Max jumped out first, landing with a soft thump on the gravel. He looked around with awe spinning in place. Is this a castle? He whispered. Wesley chuckled. Close enough. Rosie stirred as Wesley bent to lift her gently into his arms. She didn't protest. He carried her up the steps with a quiet reverence like she was made of glass. Ruby followed her shoes, nearly silent on the stone. Inside, the children were met with a whirlwind of soft voices and kind faces, nurses, aides, and doctors ready to take Rosie to her private recovery suite. Ruby hesitated, unsure whether to follow. She'll be okay, Wesley said, placing a hand on her shoulder. Dr. Lou is the best pediatric pulmonologist in the country. She's been briefed on everything. Ruby swallowed hard and nodded. She didn't let go of Max's hand. A housekeeper led them down a grand hallway lit by chandeliers and lined with paintings. Ruby looked up at them all, landscapes, seascapes, faces of people she didn't know. One portrait caught her attention, a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. That was my mother, Wesley said quietly. She gave me this house when I was your age. Ruby blinked. You lived here? As a kid, most of it, he said, but it didn't always feel like home. Not until I came back with you. They turned a corner and Ruby stopped in her tracks. Ahead of her was a room she could never have imagined, walls painted in warm, cheerful colors, bunk beds with fluffy pillows, shelves full of books and toys. A basket of stuffed animals sat in the corner next to a window that overlooked a garden. Max bolted inside without hesitation. He climbed up to the top bunk and shouted, "This is mine." Ruby didn't move. Wesley crouched beside her. You, okay, she nodded slowly, eyes scanning every detail of the room. No one's ever given us anything like this. You've never had to ask before, he replied. That ends now. She looked at him, eyes shining. Do we have to leave someday? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver key. He placed it in her hand. You belong here, as long as you want. This is your home. Ruby stared at the key, unsure if she should cry or run through the halls shouting. Instead, she just said, thank you. Later that day, Rosie was settled in her sunlit room attached to a gentle oxygen machine and surrounded by stuffed bears and medical books designed for kids. Dr. Lou spoke to Wesley privately outside the room. She's malnourished, yes, but the infection is treatable. A few months of antibiotics and proper rest, and she'll be just fine. Wesley exhaled. Relief washed over him like a tide. That night, the estate was quiet except for the gentle hum of heaters and the distant chirping of crickets. Ruby sat in the library wrapped in a knitted blanket, her bare feet tucked under her. She flipped through a book of fairy tales, her lips moving silently as she read. Max sat beside her on the rug, building a city out of wooden blocks. Wesley stood in the doorway watching them. He had taken off his tie and rolled up his sleeves. The fire behind him cast soft shadows across the bookshelves. Do you like it here? He asked. Ruby looked up from her book and nodded. It's like dreaming. But we're awake, Wesley smiled. That's how you know it's real. Max grinned and shouted, I built a bridge. A bridge to where? Wesley asked. Max pointed to Ruby. To her castle. Ruby laughed, light and honest, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged room like music. Wesley's chest tightened. This was what it meant to rebuild. Not with glass towers or numbers in a ledger, but with warmth, with safety, with love. He knelt beside them and picked up a book from the floor. Mind if I read to you both? Ruby nodded eagerly. Max scooted closer. As Wesley began to read, his voice steady and low, the fire crackled, and the night wrapped around them like a protective shield. They weren't just safe. They were home. The drawing room was quiet, its windows open to the soft hum of the garden beyond. A gentle breeze floated in, carrying the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass. Sunlight poured across the oak floors, warm and golden, bathing the room in a calm glow. On the far side, a fire crackled gently, though it was more for comfort than heat. Wesley sat at a carved mahogany table, the surface cleared of its usual books and business folders. In their place rested a small stack of legal documents, carefully arranged beside a fountain pen and a thick white envelope marked with a golden seal. Everything was ready. Everything was about to change. Ruby stood in the doorway, clutching Max's hand, her eyes darting between Wesley and the papers. She wore a pale yellow dress that one of the housekeepers had picked for her, and her hair had been neatly brushed for the occasion. But her expression held none of the joy expected for such a moment. Rosie sat beside Wesley in a wheelchair, her frame still frail, but her cheeks fuller now with a light pink color that had been absent for months. She smiled faintly at Ruby, then turned back toward Wesley with quiet anticipation. Max, meanwhile, just looked confused. "Is this another doctor thing?" he whispered. "No," Ruby whispered back. "This is something else." Wesley stood slowly, one hand resting on the table for balance. The cane was gone now, left leaning by the fireplace. He no longer needed it, at least not today. "I asked you all here for something important," he said, his voice gentle but steady, "something I've been thinking about since the moment Ruby pulled me out of that landfill." He looked at each of them in turn, Max wide-eyed and restless, Rosie tired but hopeful, Ruby quiet and guarded, her heart hidden behind years of survival. "I owe you more than I could ever put into words," he continued. "But this," he gestured to the papers, "this is more than repayment. This is a promise." He motioned for them to come closer. Ruby stepped forward, first her fingers still wrapped around Max's. They stopped just short of the table. "These are guardianship papers," Wesley said. "Once I sign them, it becomes official. From today forward, you won't just be living here. You'll be my children. Not guests, not temporary." Max blinked. "You mean like forever?" Wesley smiled. "Yes, forever." There was silence, thick and heavy. Ruby's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her eyes flicked to the documents, then back to Wesley. "But," she started, then hesitated. "We don't have anything. We're not from the kind of world you're from." Wesley stepped around the table, lowering himself slowly to one knee in front of her. He reached up gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Do you know what I had when I was your age?" he asked. "A big house, fancy clothes, tutors. But no one ever made me feel safe. No one ever made me feel like I belonged. Until now." Ruby's chin trembled. "You made me feel like I belonged," he continued. "You didn't ask who I was or what I could give you. You saw someone who needed help and you gave it. That's family, and I want to be yours." Her tears fell before she could stop them. She looked down, embarrassed, trying to swipe them away with the back of her hand. "Does this mean we'll always have a home?" she whispered. Wesley nodded, his voice low and full. "It means you never have to wonder again. This is your home. I am your father now, if you'll have me." Rosie let out a quiet sob and covered her mouth with both hands. Max stepped on forward and leaned into Wesley's chest, wrapping his little arms around him with sudden, fierce affection. Ruby stood still, shaking, before finally falling to her knees and joining them. The three of them clung to Wesley like the roots of a tree, desperate for soil, for permanence. Wesley held them close, his own tears slipping silently down his cheeks. A notary standing discreetly near the corner finally stepped forward. "Mr. Grant," he said softly, "whenever you're ready." Wesley stood, kissed Ruby gently on the crown of her head, and turned back to the table. He picked up the pen and signed each document with careful strokes. With every signature, he felt the weight of something lifting, not a burden, but a wall that had kept him disconnected for far too long. When the last page was signed and stamped, the notary nodded. "It's official. You are now the legal guardian of Ruby Max and Rosie Grant." The room went still. Rosie giggled for the first time in months, her face lighting up as she clapped softly. Max jumped and shouted, "We're Grants now, like superheroes." Ruby stood quietly, tears still slipping from her eyes. She approached the table not as a guest, not as a survivor, but as his daughter. She reached out and touched the documents, her fingers brushing the ink. "Thank you," she whispered. Wesley knelt beside her again. "It's not just a thank you," he said. "This is the beginning of everything." She looked up at him, a tearful smile finally breaking through. "Can I call you Dad?" His voice broke. "I'd like that very much." Outside, the sun had shifted, casting a glow through the windows that wrapped around the room like a golden ribbon. It didn't feel like just another morning in a mansion. It felt like the first page of a brand new life. They weren't broken anymore. They were a family. The story made headlines across the world. Billionaire Wesley Grant, found alive, saved by homeless girl, adopts her family. From shadows to sanctuary, how a 7-year-old changed a CEO's life forever. The man who lost everything and found what matters most. But for Wesley Grant, it was never about headlines, never about redemption in the public eye or viral photos splashed across the front pages of glossy magazines. The real story wasn't something the cameras could capture. It wasn't in the dramatic rescue or the downfall of his traitorous cousin Marcus, or even in the staggering wealth he had returned to. It was in the silence of early morning when the mansion was still, and the only sound was Max's tiny footsteps padding down the hall to find him. It was in the way Rosie's color returned day by day, her cough fading to a memory, her laughter now ringing down long hallways that had once echoed with emptiness. It was in Ruby's eyes, once guarded and tired, now calm, curious, and quietly joyful. A look he'd never seen in his boardrooms, no matter how many billion-dollar contracts he signed. Weeks had passed since he brought them home, and still each day felt like something new, unfamiliar, and yet completely natural. A strange, beautiful rhythm had taken root in the walls of the estate, one that wasn't scheduled by quarterly earnings or performance reviews. Instead, mornings were now filled with the clatter of cereal bowls, the squeals of Max chasing the family dog through the courtyard, and Ruby tugging Wesley's hand toward the garden, excited to show him a tomato she'd planted herself. Evenings brought story time in the library. Rosie curled under his arm with a blanket tucked around her, her breathing steady as she asked endless questions about the world outside her old train car. It was life in its purest, rawest form, and Wesley felt reborn through every moment of it. Sometimes he'd find himself standing at the edge of the estate's southern field, gazing toward the horizon, where the trees rolled endlessly into the distance. He would close his eyes and hear the phantom echoes of chains rattling on that cabin floor, the cruel laughter of the men Marcus had sent, the suffocating loneliness he had felt wandering through the woods. And then just as vividly, he'd remember the rasp of a small voice saying, "You look like someone important." Those words had haunted him at first. Now they grounded him. The media tried to make it a tale of heroism. They called Wesley the billionaire with a heart, spun his return into a myth of fortune and fate. But the truth wasn't nearly as glamorous. It was messy, painful, honest. He had been broken, shattered by betrayal, stripped of his identity, and nearly forgotten in a forest where no one was supposed to find him. But a child did. Not because she saw a man with wealth or power, because she saw someone who needed help. And in that moment, she became the hero. He often thought of the old train car, its rusted frame still standing in Glen Rock, untouched like a monument to the life they'd left behind. He had offered to have it torn down, cleared away, to make space for something new. Ruby had asked him not to. "Not because I want to go back," she said, "but because it's where everything changed." So he'd left it, preserved it. He even had a plaque placed at the edge of the clearing, small and simple. "The place where we found each other." Now, when Wesley met with world leaders, sat through economic forums, or was interviewed about his foundation, he didn't lead with numbers or market predictions. He spoke about purpose, about how sometimes the smallest acts, like a child sharing a broken phone or offering a place to sleep, can rewrite a person's entire story. His company, once focused purely on expansion, had transformed too. A new wing had opened under his direction, the Grant Foundation for Homeless Youth. Dozens of shelters had already opened in 5 cities. Mobile clinics, free literacy programs, housing grants. And always, always, he carried the photo of Ruby, Rosie, and Max tucked in his wallet like a talisman, because they were the reason behind every signature, every decision, every breath of this second chance. One evening, just before sunset, Wesley stood at the threshold of the children's playroom. The golden light stretched across the floor, catching Ruby mid-laugh as she tossed a pillow at Max. Rosie was drawing in the corner, humming a soft tune. The room pulsed with life so loud and warm that it made the air shimmer. Wesley stepped inside quietly. Ruby noticed him first and walked over, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You okay?" He nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" He paused, then said, "About how I thought I knew everything, about success, about life." Ruby tilted her head, and now he smiled. "Now I know I didn't know anything at all. Not until I met you." She didn't say anything. She just reached up and took his hand. They stood there like that father and daughter, surrounded by the new world they'd built out of the broken pieces of the old one. A world where the forgotten became family, where pain gave way to purpose, where a girl who had nothing gave everything and unknowingly saved a man who had once believed he already had it all. Wesley Grant didn't need the headlines. He had his story, and now finally he had his home, his children, his family reborn. We'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and rate this story from 10 to 100. Tell us where you're watching from too. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. And if this touched your heart, check out more uplifting videos by clicking on the end screen now.